Hi everybody, and welcome to our SawDustU tutorials on upgrading your table saw. Our first video in this series, I guess we'll call it Sliding Table 101, was sort of an overview of the way I upgraded this old contractor saw with the addition of a sliding table and a nice precision saw fence. This video, or two, depending on how it goes, will be concentrating on the sliding table. It's hard to overemphasize the advantage of having one of these sliding tables. You can design this particular version to fit your needs. On my earlier version with my big Powermatic saw, I had the sled was 6 inches wider, the rails were a little bit longer. But when I retired and got to doing smaller projects like the corner cupboard that I highlighted in the first video, I just didn't need that size of a table to handle my projects. So I designed this and came up with it, and really the key to the whole system, in fact both for this project, the sliding table, and for the precision saw fence that I came up with, depends on these CNC components. I was at a woodworking show some years ago and was marveling at the router zipping around on these beautiful chrome rails, making all kinds of amazing shapes and stuff. And I said, boy, if I could ever get a source for those rails, I could use those in my woodworking. And it took me a while, but I did find them without all the paraphernalia that goes with the normal motorized CNC production stuff. So what I'm going to do here is I'll start at the top and I'll give a brief comment, take it apart, just so you know what parts we're talking about, and then we'll start at the base here and work our way up to the top. So the first thing is the hold down, which I'll get back to later. Then we have the fence, which is a nice extruded aluminum, 1/4 inch thick, 6061 tempered grade 6 aircraft quality aluminum. Makes a beautiful solid fence. I use the same grade on the sliding table, on the table saw fence, but in a rectangular tube shape. So here we are. This is the sled. You'll probably want to vary the top simply because the pieces that I found to reinforce it, which I'll show you when I flip it over, are not that easy to find. I happened to stumble on some nice tubular metal steel box beams that I cut up and used, but the odds of you finding that same thing is probably like a needle in a haystack. So another way to form your sled, this happens to be 1/2 inch corian with the metal supports. I'll show you. In fact, I'll back this off. Let me make a comment too, is you see this little pin? I normally have that here in the end of my rail so that when I pull this back, I don't have to worry about pulling the sled off onto my foot or ruining my workpiece or whatever. So that comes out to remove it. This pulls straight back. It's quite heavy. And I'll put it on an angle here so we can take a look-see. Here you see those steel box beams, this horrid blue corian, which I had to paint aluminum color on the other side so I could look at it. But basically the system involves around, as I said, these steel rails. This is a piece of the rail off of its support mechanism. Comes like this with an extruded aluminum base with a little groove in it, and the 20 millimeter, which is over 3/4 of an inch, hardened steel rail sits into those grooves and is screwed every 6 or 7 inches, whatever. Of course it's metric, but approximately 6 or 7 inches. Makes a very, very solid base. It can, here where I have a span involved for the rails, there's absolutely no deflection. It's a very, very strong system. If you've ever worked in construction and messed with 5/8 inch rebar, you know how strong that is. Well, this is hardened steel, and as I said, 0.78 inches, very, very strong. So that's part A of the main component. The other part, and maybe the most critical, are these guide blocks. These are what are called linear guide blocks. I don't know whether you can see them on the video or not, but there are rows of linear ball bearings within each of these things. There's a slight dust shield on each end, and then a little plastic housing that holds the ball bearings in alignment, and they ride against a hardened steel tube that fits inside this aluminum guide block. There is a screw on the side of these guide blocks and one on the underneath side that allow you to control the grip, if you will, of those guide blocks on your rail. So when you're first setting this thing up, you want to take your guide blocks, slide them onto your rails, and then adjust those 2 screws, put a little bit of thread locker on them so you can get it to where you like it and it'll stay. So you just want a nice slide so it goes with just a tad of resistance. In other words, you saw how easily that one slides here. And this is quite a heavy table I've got here. Just like that. Very nice. No play. It's a marvelous system. It really works well. Assuming you can't find these steel beams or you don't have some of the other steel to use for your reinforcement, you'll probably go the way I did on my first one, which is to use 2 sheets of 1/2-inch cabinet grade plywood. I happen to have used some Baltic birch plywood, which is probably the best, but a good 1/2-inch cabinet grade plywood. You might even do 3/4 and 1/2-inch to make a laminate up with no voids in it, please. And you can attach your guide blocks to that 1/2-inch layer, leaving the heads of the screws you attach the guide blocks to your sled with proud, so you have a full 1/2-inch of meat holding these guide blocks in place. And then you can put pocket holes with a Forstner bit on the back side, and then so when you set your top layer of plywood on top of your sled, those pocket holes will allow you to drop this down flush with your surface. So it makes a real nice strong setup. Another thing, and this is critical, and this played a role in both the table saw fence and the sled here. The only fly in the ointment with these guide blocks that I found is when I first got them, I measured the distance between the holes, drilled 4 holes equidistant on my pattern, went to put them up, and the holes did not align with the holes I drilled. And upon closer inspection, which surprised me, the holes were not, obviously hadn't been done by a robot. They had been done by a human being trying to get to his lunch break by hand. And they varied, I'm going to say, by up to 1 millimeter in distance north, south, east, west on the back of the block. Now, as far as the alignment of the center and the ball bearings, I haven't had any problems with those at all, but the holes were problematic. So the question was, how do you transfer the holes on your guide blocks, both on your sled here or on the base for your sliding table? And this was the answer I came up with. I'm going to get that as close as I can so you can see it. Now, I also will put some close-ups of these components on the website, SawDustU.com, and that way you can really get a good shot of it. It shows the ball bearings, and it'll show these acorn nuts. If you can't find these acorn nuts, I'll try to find a source for them and put them under my list of materials. If I can't, there are some other options you can use. Let me show you how I use them first, and then I'll explain some of the other options you've got. Number one is you take your guide block, you want to put an arrow in the direction you're working, doesn't matter, just whatever you're comfortable with, like point your arrow towards the wall and all the arrows go that way. You can see I've got an arrow here, this happened to be reversed, so it's coming towards me. And then number them 1, 2, 3, 4. You then take your little acorn nuts and you screw them into the holes on the back side of the guide blocks. Now you've got something, you can put a guide block up here and you can press your ball bearing guide blocks, press it down against your substrate, whether it's corian or metal or plywood or whatever you're using, and the head of the acorn nut will leave a dimple if it's a soft material. If it's a hard material, you can put a little dab of paint on the tip and it'll leave 4 little dots. Those become your guides for your drill. So then you take your sled over to your drill press and you drill 6 millimeter holes through all of your little dots. What that does is it allows you to attach these guide blocks without having a lot of slop and play in them. So what I did was snug them down to where they were reasonably tight. I put a rail through to hold it in alignment, both of them here. As I was going, double checked my measurements with a set of calipers and then cranked them down tight with thread locker on them. Same thing on this side. That gives me my alignment here and will hold it rigid for your keeping it parallel to your saw. The other component I want to show you, which I mentioned earlier, you can see it here. This is another one of those end rail supports. And what that does is it, in the various configurations, you'll see it on these systems, is, of course this is the underneath side, but it allows the scrap rod I have here, which I use as my pivot, to come from the other side and go right through there, and it's nice and tight. All I have to do if I want it to lock it in is use my little Allen wrench, tighten down this screw a little half turn, not even that really, quarter turn, and it will lock that rod in place. Very nice system, and it's designed to be used with these rails, so it's a perfect fit. Let me flip this over, set that on here. Now, when you align your rails over your platform, and a word here about that, in fact, let me slide this forward. You can see here I've got an open platform. This works well for me because I can unbolt it with 2 bolts and hang it on my shelf over there. The saw then is all on casters. I can roll that out of the way and get it out of the way of the shop here, so when I sort of retire the shop for the summer, when I move my projects outdoors, they're out of the way. Come next winter, I'll bring it all back out again and build another corner cupboard or more or something clever. But your platform can be anything you want. As I said, my first one was a plywood cabinet, a long skinny plywood cabinet that went up against the saw. You want to be aware of when you do that and you lay out your rails to allow for the motor if you're using a contractor saw, a motor cover if you've got a left tilting blade like on my Powermatic. You may need to put an extension if you've got a crank down here for, tilting the blade, all those sort of things. Take a look at what's going on with your saw before you lock this in place. Once you get your cabinet or your platform, however you're going to form your base for your rails, leave them on loose. Attach your sliding, this is just sitting on top, but of course you'd have them in the rails. And then go ahead and press the sliding table snug up against your edge of your saw, table saw. Maybe use a playing card or a feeler gauge to give yourself a little bit of a gap. And then you can set a clamp on your rails at various positions and maybe tack a screw through on the ends, hand tighten, make sure they're aligned, slide your table back and forth, and you'll get your alignment good there. So that should work like a charm. You'll be good. And once it's locked in place, then you go back and pre-drill your holes and put your screws through into your plywood or to your metal in this case. And this thing is locked on, it's not going anywhere. The one on my Powermatic I used for 1.5 years. This one is 1 year old now, and I've never had any problems with alignment, wearing unevenly or anything. It's a really nice system. And as I said, the key to my system here that I love is that I don't have any tabletop machinery or rails or tubular supports in this part of the saw. In other words, you see here I can stand right here. When I load my sled back here and I step forward following the sled, watching my saw blade, watching material go through the blade, I'm in total control the whole way. It's a really nice, safe system to use. I used to have one that had a rail down here at the bottom, a pipe rail, and the triangular support for the sliding table rolled on that. And I swear to God, every time I walked around the table, I'd smash my shins, which made me come up with this design. So I like it. I'll go ahead and cut this video short here. I'll come back, detail out what we did on the fence. And as I said, we'll have close-ups of the various components on the website and a list of links for sources for these if you don't have them locally. So thanks for watching. I'll pick you up in a minute and we'll take you through the rest of the sliding table, and then the next video after that we'll move to the fence. Thanks for watching.